Hello, art historians, and welcome to our second lecture over medieval European art. And remember, this is kind of the art of the Middle Age for Europe when they're in between the fall of Rome and the rise of the Renaissance, which is really kind of their, post-classical period. And really, we talked about the only thing that's really going to remain in Europe from the classical time period of Rome is going to be Christianity. And that's going to be a huge influence on the art and architecture on the European continent. So when we last left what we were talking about the art of Hiberno-Saxon, so basically like the British Isles. Now we're going to be moving back to the European continent. And during this time, there was a group of German barbarians called the Franks. And the Franks had actually invaded into Central Europe and had basically set up a feudal kingdom there. And what this means is that Clovis, the king of the Franks, was giving away land. He was very, very Christian. Like he became baptized after he married a Christian girl, and his dynasty, known as the Merovinian dynasty, basically said that they were related to Jesus. Like they were not just going to be Christian, they were going to be, descendants of Jesus, basically. If you've ever seen the Da Vinci Code, they actually talk about this at the end of it, where she comes from the sang real, or the royal blood. So he establishes in France, Clovis, this feudal kingdom where he gives away land to lords. Lords are in charge of giving land to knights who will provide protection for the peasants and also for the king if he ever needs it. And the Franks are going to make the decision to adopt Christianity under Clovis because that basically gave them religious legitimacy, because the Pope would say, yes, you do get to rule because you are, blessed by God, basically. And it was actually the Merovinian family who are going to be actually, he wasn't part of the family, but under the Merovinians, one of the mayors, who history knows as Charles the Hammer Martel, will stop the Islamic invasion from reaching into France out of Spain. So what we're going to see happen is the Merovinians started this process of really trying to bring back the glory of the Roman Empire. They were kind of considering themselves to be like the descendants of that, basically. So they were wanting to use art visually, because remember, they don't have big buildings right now. Like big building really goes on pause after the Romans fell for a very long time, like 600 years, basically. So you have to have other ways to visually reinforce your rule. So they like to have works of art that they could wear, that they could give as gifts, and that really shone like their artistic talent, basically. So in the royal burials of these Merovinian kings, we have found a lot of jewelry, a lot of items that kind of showed their wealth and their status, kind of like the funeral banner of Lady Di. And we have seen what we call the Merovinian Fibulae. So remember the French fibulae, basically. And these fibulae were used to kind of hold together Roman togas. So it was something that the Romans had long done. And so these guys are going to be like, well, if they did that, we are going to do that. And the Germans were also very good with metalworking, which may have been something that they got from the Vikings. So these fibulae were covered in like jewels and different, stones that were set into this bent metal. Sometimes they were melted into enamel, but this metalworking is something we would have seen in Europe that could have also been Viking influence. So this is the Merovinian looped fibulae, and you can see why, because it's got those little loops that are in it. And this is actually a new art technique called cloisonne, where you take these pieces of metal and you bend them, and then you put in gems or stones or like melted enamel into that. And again, the Vikings, who may have taught these people how to do this, were portable. Like they needed stuff that was portable to take with them that could also show their status. So gold, silver, all of these metals, and then with these precious stones into it. These are actually, the ones for the 250 are actually in the shape of an eagle. And eagles can fly very high, so they kind of were considered symbols of the sun. And since Rome considered themselves the light of the world, the Roman standard of battle, like the standard they would carry into battle, would have a lot of eagles on it, which will later also be adopted by the Germans during the Third Reich. So this whole idea of, basically using the eagle and the symbol is kind of just showing that these guys were really trying to establish a new Rome on the, European continent. Now, eventually the Merovinians are going to fall apart, and they're going to be replaced by a new dynasty called the Carolingians. And under the Carolingians, you first have Pepin the Short, and then you have Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. And Charlemagne was named the first Holy Roman Emperor in the year 800 on Christmas Day. Charlemagne, for a brief second, he was very educated. He wanted his people to be educated, really started to work to recreate Rome in all its glory. And that means he was very, very Christian. He had Bibles translated so that everybody could read it. He spread Christianity everywhere that he went, through like mass baptisms, which means that he had the Pope on his side. And for a brief second, under Charlemagne, we start to see the Roman light flicker back on. But unfortunately, after his death, his son divided his empire up between 3 grandsons, which will become France, Germany, and then this area in between, that basically undid everything that Charlemagne tried to do. So that was Charlemagne's empire, and it was this massive Christian empire that he basically is establishing Europe as a Christian continent to help gain support from the Pope. And you can see here, this is actually Charlemagne's palace in Aachen, Germany, which would have shown that he had had some exposure to the areas under Islamic control, because we can see the different color voussoirs up there. But you can also see that it's got that central design, kind of like the palace of San Vitale in Ravenna, the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna, which he thought was the most perfect church, and he modeled his palace after it. This is actually a sculpture of Charlemagne right here, or they believe it to be. And you can see here that he's kind of, it's small, so it's not very big, but he's kind of bringing back that Roman, art style for just a brief second. But then for another 200 years, basically, after Charlemagne dies, everything kind of goes back into the dark and the lights flicker off again until the year 1000. All right, the year 1000 is a big time period in European history, because basically, by this point, everything had settled down. All of Europe was divided up into its respective kingdoms. Europe had been united under Christianity, which means that everybody's following the rules of the Pope, except, of course, for the parts of Spain, which were Islamic. Europe was much safer. There was trade starting to happen. Most of it was happening in Italy. And the kings and the church were starting to enter a little bit of a power struggle, if you will, over who actually had more power in the medieval European empire over their people. Because remember, a king is a king of his country, but the Pope is king of all Christians, basically. So there's going to start to be some butting heads as kings start to establish their power and wonder just how much they really need the church to solidify that power anymore. So the church is going to need to step up their game a little bit. So you can see here in the year 1000, Europe is kind of settled a little bit. It's kind of all, and you can see the Caliphate of Cordoba. That's an Islamic area where you'd find the Alhambra and the Mosque of Cordoba. Now, funny story, they actually had believed, and the church had been teaching, that in the year 1000, the world was going to end. So this is one of the reasons why, really, since Rome had fallen, A, because they didn't have the technology, B, they didn't have the money, and C, they didn't think that the world was going to last long enough. They hadn't really built any major buildings since Rome, because why would you bother if the world was going to end? And most people wouldn't go to them anyway, because they were safely tucked away on their manors, being protected by their lords. So in the year 1000, when the world didn't end, the church is trying to reestablish its image a little bit, and was like, hey, we're going to be so thankful that the world didn't end, which it must have not ended because we were such amazing people, that we're going to build these big, wonderful churches for people to come and visit and pray and give thanks to God that this didn't happen. Well, kings aren't going to miss this opportunity. They're going to say, oh, well, if we're going to build these big buildings, a lot of the times kings would be like, we will give the money to do this and we will support it. So the church would support them. And then they would give these churches tax breaks so they didn't have to pay for them. So as a result of this, the kings kind of answered back with, okay, well, fine. If you're going to build them, we're going to pay for them so that way we achieve some status as well. But since Rome fell 600 years ago, people weren't really sure how to build these really big buildings. So they looked back to the last example they had, which is going to be the Roman basilicas. So what we enter into in the year 1000 is a style called Romanesque, which means that you are building Roman-like buildings. All right. So basically, they are like the basilicas, which they really were basilicas, and they're going to use structures like the Romans, like barrel vaults and arches and columns. Like those are going to start to come back. However, they are still going to be very clear that any decoration needs to be deliberately not natural. It needs to tell a story so that people get the point. But it cannot be anything that looks like an idol. It can't be three-dimensional. It can't be anything that looks too realistic, because we don't want to be pagan the way the Romans were with all their, statues. So the idea was that in the year 1000, Europe basically was just covered in the building of these cathedral basilicas. Over 500 were built across Europe. And eventually so many of them were developed that they wrote almost travel guides for people on which ones to visit, where to eat when you go there, where to stay. Like it became like those books when you go to Disney or Europe or anything like that. So how are you going to pay for this though? Like that's going to be the problem. Like you build these big churches, and if a king is not paying for it, how are you going to pay for it? The answer for that came in relics. So if you had something awesome enough at your cathedral that people wanted to come and see and give donations, then you could make some money off of this. And relics are holy objects. And it really depends on what the object is that gives it its worth. So for example, in Chartres Cathedral, it was the Mary's Veil was a really big one. And in Notre Dame Cathedral, it was the Crown of Thorns. These are the ones that, people wanted to come and see, and the more people came and paid, to see them and gave donations and, stuff to the church, the more money they had and the bigger they could make the churches. All right. So the biggest items were ones directly related to Jesus or the Holy Royal Family. And then things like pieces of the true cross, bones of saints and martyrs, entire bodies. Those were things that people would come and want to see. And for a minute, if you think that this is weird, let me remind you that people pay millions of dollars every year to go to Graceland in Memphis, Tennessee, because that's where all the holy relics of Elvis are, and he's buried in the backyard. So yeah, they're not that crazy, okay? So churches needed to be built. So this created a function issue. So if people are going to come and visit these relics, then we need to make sure that they have the ability to come and see the relics and at the same time not disturb the mass that's going on, because these are functional churches, all right? And they would play this up. They would say that these relics could give healing powers, that could provide magic, like to touch one or kiss one could heal people. And they were usually covered in things like gold or decorated so that way people would, give to this relic. So for example, here's some relics of hands. Now, could it be that the relics weren't always legit and real? Yes. Were there instances where sometimes relics would cry blood and it would be somebody using, duck's blood? Yes, that did happen. But there were a lot of them that had, relics that they believed the true authenticity of it. So this was how they got around the issue of, well, wait a minute, are these idols that we're worshiping? And they said this: it is not an impure idol that receives the worship of an oracle or of a sacrifice. It is a pious memorial before which the faithful heart feels more easily and more strongly touched by solemnity and employs more fervently the powerful intercession of the saint for its sins. So in short, no, these are okay, is what the church said. So this is a standard Romanesque church that you are looking at right here. And you can see that what makes it Roman-like. It's a basilica-style church. That's the big one. It has columns on the front, usually for decoration, that don't hold anything up. There is barrel vaulting. There is arches. It is Roman-like, and it will have the interior structure that the basilicas we've seen in the past will have. Take a look on the inside. All right. So and Romanesque buildings are heavy. All right. They're almost thick with stone. So you have columns, all right, some of which are for decoration. Mostly the arches hold everything up and not really the columns. You can see the barrel vaulted ceiling. You can see that second floor triforium of windows up there. And then you can see you're standing in the nave, and then down at the end is the apse. This is the floor plan of a Romanesque church up here on the top, and below it is Santa Sabina. So that is the early Christian basilica that we looked at, where they basically just copied a Roman basilica. But you can see Romanesque are Roman-like, but not completely, because what you're going to see here is a T shape. Romanesque churches go like this, okay? So they have this T out to the side to kind of look like a cross. You have the nave here in the center. You have the apse, but then if you look around the apse, you'll see what's called radiating chapels. And these little chapels were meant there for the relics to be held. Now, if you look at everywhere, there's a little X. That was an area where people could walk. So you've got side doors where people can come in, view the relics, pray, and walk out and not disturb the mass. And then right here in the very center, okay, so this all would be open, but then up in the ceiling, in the middle of this T, which is called the transept would have a bell tower over the top. And that bell tower would be basically at the heart, representing God's or Jesus's ascension into heaven. So you can see here just another couple, Romanesque buildings. All right, so that's Santa Sabina here on the bottom. That is Romanesque on the top, which is Roman-like, but doesn't really look exactly like the old Roman basilicas. So we've kind of already talked about this, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here. You can pause it if you need to get this, but we have basically what makes these the Romanesque style, what makes it Roman-like. And again, here are the parts you can see here. All right, so the X's are your ambulatory aisles where people could walk. You have your apse, you have your reliquary chapels. People can walk out the side, okay, and then not disturb the mass. And then the nave would have above the nave, right in the transept or the T, you would have that bell tower reaching up towards the top. This is an exterior that you can see perfectly what a Romanesque church looks like. So you can see the long basilica nave. You can see the bell tower coming up to the top. So the tower in the middle of the transept, that's that T, all right? Then you have the apse here, and then you can see the little radiating chapels coming out of it where the relics could have been held. So Romanesque churches were what they called pilgrimage churches. That's what their entire function was for, is for these religious journeys to come to these churches on this religious trip to see these relics, all right? So again, the form follows the function, all right? So they shaped these churches as a way to reinforce Christianity, obviously with the cross shape and the tower at the center, using and adopting the basilica style. And then you have the function of the apse with the radiating chapels to hold the relics so that people could come to worship and view the relics without disturbing the mass. So if you look here, this is everything that's on there. Those lines are routes along these pilgrimage trails. And you can see here that Romanesque style will make its way into England across from France. Like it will get there. But the thickest part of it was usually in this northern part of Spain. Like Santiago de Compostela is one of the most famous Romanesque churches that's there. But all these spots, these red spots, were these pilgrimage churches that you could stop ultimately to get to Santiago de Compostela, which is considered to be like the really big one. And this is Santiago de Compostela in northern Spain right here, which kind of was the ultimate design of Romanesque churches. And again, it was claimed to have the bones of Saint James, so one of the major figures in the Bible during the life of Jesus. And this is the floor plan right here of Santiago de Compostela, which kind of became like this, the floor plan basically for how you do a Romanesque church. This is another example of one. So you can see they don't always look exactly the same, but you should be able to look at a floor plan and go, that is definitely Romanesque. I know that from looking at it. Because you can see here the ambulatory aisles, the apse, the reliquary chapels. You can see the transept right here, and then the four columns where the tower would be reaching up into the heavens. So just like with the other basilicas in Roman times, you're going to see that three-level appearance. So the lower level, your triforium, and then your clear story at the top. And because these buildings were so thick and heavy, you don't have a whole lot of room for a lot of windows. All right, so they're going to be a little bit darker than you would typically see in what we're going to look at later on. Now, the exterior of these buildings was very significant as well for people who were traveling to come to these pilgrimage churches. And this is what you would typically see. It's called the tympanum. So like timpani drum, which is like round, like this is the tympanum. And this would be placed above the door. And you can see here that it's not three-dimensional. It's very it's not trying to make it look naturalized. They're almost going in reverse and bringing back hierarchy of scale. But right in the center of it, you have Jesus on the throne of wisdom. You have Jesus with the halo around him. On each side, you typically have angels and saints, and usually Mary is there too. On his right hand, you can see the image of people who are being saved. And on the left, you can see the people who are being damned to hell. Like you can see the demons pulling them down into hell. You can see them suffering. And the whole reason for putting this over the door was so that if you were walking into this church, you would enter on what we're looking at as the right, but you would be entering on the left side of Jesus. And as you're walking through, you would be entering on the damned side. But then as you were leaving, your back would be facing the saved side. So for an illiterate population, they're not seeing the saved side. They're only seeing the damned side and reminding them of why it is that they need to come to church in the first place. All right. So in these last judgment, these are called the portal sculptures. All right. So portal meaning like the entrance to the door. So like the entrance to the building in the portal. All right. You would typically have, again, you can see that this is not the talent level that we had in Greece and Rome. You know what they were able to create. So the idea is don't make it naturalistic. We're not going for talent. We're going for the message here. So it has to be very attached to the wall and just relief enough to really show those scenes or what it's about. And things like Adam and Eve, scenes of Adam and Eve, falling to temptation and being cast from the Garden of Eden and reminding people that you are sinners because of this, which is why you need to come into the church. So this is an example of one of those portal sculptures. And you can see that it's very flat. It's nothing fancy. But as you come in, you're going to enter under the damned side and you're going to leave under the saved side. Okay, so we kind of talked about this already. So let's look at an example of a true Romanesque church that kind of in France became like the example or the standard. And this is going to be Sanfoy, all right, which is located in France. If you need a way to remember that, put the F's together. Very, very typical Romanesque floor plan. And it was named for a girl who would not worship Roman gods. So she was martyred at the age of 12. Like she was willing to die for her faith. So this reliquary you have here, a reliquary would hold the relics and usually be in the shape of the relics that it was holding. This was built for Saint Foy, and you can see that it has had multiple jewels and things added to it, and it's gold plated, but it's not an idol. But it is very, very decorated by people who would come and visit and leave offerings to Saint Foy to receive her blessing. It's a pretty good size sculpture that this church was built for. And one of the things that was noted about it is it was made being recycled from pieces of an old Roman sculpture. So here you can see that this is the reliquary sitting inside the Church of Saint Foy, just near the apse. And this is a video of them processing, like they do this ceremony in 2000. Okay, so this is actually, I think this is beautiful. This is the Church of Sanfoy. Again, the example of Romanesque architecture that they've chosen to use for the 250. Beautiful location, settled into the hills. And remember, this would be typical because you usually wouldn't want to have to go too far off of a manor or an area because of threat of attack or invasion. So this is tucked into this little village, and you can see just from looking at it that it's got the entrance, all right, facing towards, the east and west axis. Then you would have the nave right here, and then the tower in the middle of the transept, which you can see the T sticking out. and then the apse with the reliquary chapels. So you can notice that Romanesque churches typically, you can see the barrel vaults on the interior. And then you can see here that it's pretty, sparse on the front. Like Romanesque churches didn't really have a whole lot of sculpture other than that portal sculpture, which was didactic. It wasn't decorative. It was there to send a message and to teach as part of the lesson. This is the floor plan of Sanfoy. You can see that it kind of fits the style of all the other Romanesque churches. And the Last Judgment is on the portal sculpture on the tympanum, all right? And a cross actually splits up the scene of this, and it would have originally been painted for people to be able to see it better, which is not uncommon. Greek works were typically painted too. And what's crazy about this is they actually have Mary and Peter are on the saved. So like St. Peter, Peter, what am I trying to say? Peter the fisherman, so the first pope, basically the person who became the first pope, Mary, and then you have underneath them is, the whole idea of paradise, because they've already achieved paradise. Sanfoy is actually shown kneeling before God. So like she's actually put into this portal sculpture, and she's saving people from Spain, all right, because the French knew the plight of the Christians in Spain. So she was trying to intercede on their behalf. And it says on it, "O sinners," come on, let's go back, "change your morals before you might face a cruel judgment." So this is the portal sculpture on the tympanum of the Last Judgment. And you can see it's got the Latin words up there, all right, so that people can read it. So there's Latin words all over this. You can see Jesus sitting in the center of it, and on his right hand are those who are saved. So Sanfoy is actually, Saint Foy is there begging for the lives of people. She's trying to intercede. Even the church in paradise down here looks like you've got little Roman cherubs in here. You've got little colonnades, you've got arches. Like it's very Roman-like for people who are trying not to be like the Romans. Their stuff looks pretty Roman here. And then if you look on the left side, you have the damned, and you have Satan right there in the middle. You have terrible fates befalling these people as they're being pulled down, and the angels are trying to intercede. And here is Saint Foy kneeling and praying and try to save those people, but nothing they can do for them. So here's just some zoomed in details of this. So you can see the Latin. You can see over here, "Pax" is peace. All right, so you can see where the paint remains. So you can see Mary, and you can see Saint Peter, because Peter always holds keys, because he holds the kingdom of heaven. All right, Saint Foy is begging for their mercy, trying to save them. And here you can see the split line right here. So in the cross, you can see people who are trying to get away from hell on this side. They're trying to pull them through the door into paradise. Like, come on, I got you. I'll save you. And up here, this angel is trying to beat back this demon. Like, get back, demon. You can't have them. And we will protect you. And then look at these terrible things that are happening over here to these poor people who didn't choose the right path. And there is Satan right in the middle of it. And you can see these horrible things and tortures that are happening to all these poor people. And it's definitely not trying to make it look naturalistic in any way, shape, or form. It's just trying to convey this message very clearly to people that the church is their salvation. Look at what's happening to this guy. They're like hanging him upside down. Like, this is just terrible. All right, so we are now done with early medieval art, and we'll be moving into Gothic art, which is the transition out of Romanesque.